alright, I know I'm filming on Halloween, but you don't need to go all Victorian curtain on me. How very rude. Hi guys, it's Leanne and I am here today with my tops and bottoms for October. I've come kind of like a goth licorice all sort today. And in fairness, that's kind of how I feel. Like, it all looks really good on the surface, but it leaves kind of a bad and disappointing aftertaste. This is going to be really long and you know your girl likes a ramble, so I'm just gonna... For the month of October, I took part in #BookBuddyAthon, the horror edition. The good news is I had a great reading month. I came out with 4 top books to talk to you about. The other slightly sad news is that I also have like 4 bottoms. Let's start with an absolute top. Let's just get off on a good note. The first book that I'm going to talk about is Pet by Akwaeke Emezi. This is a YA horror which essentially metaphorically looks at a utopian world which in theory does not contain any more racism or homophobia or violence. Effectively, there are no monsters left in the city of redemption. But then one night Jam accidentally cuts her hand and drips her blood on one of her mother's sort of surrealist paintings, and something crawls out of it. Let's just start off by saying I have never read anything like this before. Akwaeke Emezi has a really interesting tone which is at the same time super layered. Her writing is beautiful and graphic and everything just feels like it's being beamed into your brain in full technicolor. But at the same time, she is really sparing with her language and really simplistic sometimes. And the two sort of juxtaposed together really lend themselves to this sort of really super bright world where everything's great now, but there are shadowy patches appearing everywhere in Jam's mind. It's really difficult to talk about this novel in any kind of concrete way without giving massive spoilers because it is so short. It is such a tiny bite of a novel, but oh, the actual breadth of representation that Akwaeke Emezi has managed to like shove into this tiny text and the way that it's normalised just... Our main character is not only black, but she is also trans, and she is selectively verbal, and she uses various sign languages with different people, and one of the ways that she kind of signals her trust is to choose to speak to that person. And there's so much to unpack in such a brief little book, and I cried at the end of this one. So yes, in short, if you are even passingly interested in this novel, I promise it will serve you so much more than you expect from it. Ugh. Now, while we're talking about representation, let us talk about one of my bottoms for the month. This is Bliss House by Laura Benedict, and I was extremely excited for it. It was marketed as a very traditional ghost story where a mother and daughter have gone through some horrible times and they move back to their old family mansion which has been left uninhabited for a really long time to try and start over. That was the premise of it. That sounds great as the premise of any kind of haunted house novel. I was immediately hooked and I was so incredibly disgusted with this novel. Not disappointed, but actively disgusted. I knew at the start of this novel that there had been an accident which had happened to the family. And part of the start of this novel is finding out exactly what that accident was while they're kind of moving into Bliss House. And I really like that too. That's a good horror trope where you're exploring a new place while finding out the backstory of the characters, but also finding out that there's creepy stuff in the house, and then the second act of the novel gets to find out the creepy backstory of the house. So I was excited when I discovered that this was what the book was doing. And the writing is perfectly fine. It's not amazing, but it is totally serviceable. It's very page-turny. However, I then discovered that the accident which happened at the beginning of this novel was a fire, and that the young girl in the family had been really, really badly burned. And that is where all of my problems started and where my DNF inevitably came from, and I could see it in the distance, I could feel that it was coming, I held it off for as long as possible, but in the end I absolutely could not get past the representation of this young girl's disfigurement. At several points in this novel she is described as having a ruined face. And every time somebody meets her for the first time, there is always the same plotted out shocking reveal where she will be hiding behind her hair, and then she'll turn around and they'll see her full face and they'll immediately be like, oh, how horrible for her, what beauty she has lost, how will she cope? There are some really massive judgment calls which are placed on her worth and her ability to be in the world post this accident that I was just so uncomfortable with. Her mother does it, all of the people in the town who meet her do it. The only person who doesn't do it is another teenage boy character who she meets, and it's very much obvious that he's the only person who hasn't been disgusted by her appearance, and so therefore he should have some sort of virtue signalled upon him for the fact that he is big enough to see past this, and clearly it was also the start of like a love interest set up. She also now walks with a cane, and one of the things that happens in the house is that as the house starts to haunt her and starts to change her perceptions of reality, she slowly starts to need the cane less and less, which for her mother and everybody else around her is a great thing. They're all like so happy that suddenly she doesn't need this cane and she doesn't need to be crippled. How much easier it would be for her to fit in and be a whole person without it. It's a really deep shame for me as well, because I was really interested in where the haunting section for this one was going, but I now have to say that I would completely not recommend this book in any way. Let's talk about another top then. Let's talk about a haunted house story which absolutely served this month. I have been for the longest time sitting on The Family Plot by Sherry Priest. There's something about the cover and the blurb of it which just said to me it was absolutely going to be a book that I loved, and sometimes when I have that, I then keep those books on my shelf for forever, for just like, I don't know, a rainy day or the right time. And so I was really glad that Book Buddyathon gave me so many prompts that allowed me to go through my backlist, because it also kind of allowed me to put this one on my list with like no guilt, because what better a time to pull out all of the books that you think are going to be 5 stars than 2020, you know what I'm saying? We all deserve some compensation at this point. It's also kind of funny actually the way that that's worked out, comparing Bliss House to The Family Plot, because everything that Bliss House did really poorly, The Family Plot did so incredibly well. This is about Dahlia. She works for Music City Salvage, which is her father's organisation, which is very much going bust. They are given the opportunity to go into an old family estate and absolutely rip it to bits, like take the oak off the walls, take the stained glass windows out, but because everything is like really on a shoestring budget at this point, they have to stay in the house. And I love that as like the reason that they have to stay in the house, because sometimes I find that the reason that people have to stay in the haunted house in horror is a little bit tenuous. This book just did so many things right. I was so invested in Dahlia. She's an amazing character. She's one of those female characters who is absolutely kick-ass, but without the author having to remind you about it every 3rd page. Instead, she just bosses the whole thing. She's the only woman who is on a salvage crew of entirely men, some of them who are family members, and so she had to keep this weird motley crew of people in line, make these really like big decisions of what they were going to prioritise and what they were going to take, and yet she was also dealing with a recent divorce and losing the house that she was absolutely in love with. And this house in The Family Plot totally preyed on all of the things that was going on in her backstory, and I loved that. The other thing that I really love about this one is that there are actual ghosts. So I really love haunted house novels of all different varieties, including like the insidious ones that just do things to you but you never actually see, or also, you know, the ones where you actually have like poltergeist activity and things like that. But the thing that I love the most, like the absolute most, is when you actually get to see a ghost or speak to a ghost, and that happens in this one at several points. This one also delivered just the right amount of creepy on every page, where there was no lulls in the action at all. Every single page was building on the plot, and because of that I was just like racing through it. Well, I say racing through it like I'm doing this. I was listening to the audio. I basically put my entire life on pause just so I could finish this book. And because there's this building level of creepiness, there's a couple of points where it's kind of almost overwhelming, where I was like, oh, I'm so creeped out that I don't know if I want to keep listening to this, but I'm gonna keep listening to this because I need to know what happens. It's just so good. It's so very good. It was everything that I wanted, and I honestly think that if you love haunted house books as much as me, you need to dip your toe into this one. And before I finish raving about it, because I was listening to it on audiobook, the narrator is amazing. Next up, I'm about to serve a slightly unpopular opinion. So during Book Buddy-a-thon, I actually buddy read a few books with my buddy, and one of them was When No One Is Watching by Alyssa Cole. And you know what, it's funny, I say it's going to be an unpopular opinion, but when I was actually putting this one on my DNF shelf on Goodreads, I checked the reviews of the people on my friends list. The ratings for it seem firmly split down the middle between people who think it is amazing and have given it 5 stars, and people who have given it 2 and 3 stars and are like, eh. And unfortunately, I fall somewhere between the eh and the actively not liking it bit. This one is about Sydney, who is a black woman who lives in a predominantly black neighbourhood in Brooklyn, and she is quietly watching her neighbourhood be taken out from under her. So many of the people that she knew and grew up with in the neighbourhood are leaving with no apparent reason why. There's a lot of other layers to this, but essentially the plot is finding out exactly where these people are going and why. I started out really loving this. Again, I was listening to this one on audiobook. The narrator is phenomenal, and I really like Alyssa Cole's writing. She is very good at giving you tiny pocket descriptions of a character and immediately making you emotionally invested in them. I loved the neighbourhood that she created. She has a definite flair for making you feel like buildings are part of the character of the place that you live, and I love that. I also loved the commentary on racism in this novel, so all of that was like really good. I loved all of it. However, one of the things that happens in this novel is that Sydney meets a guy called Theo, who is one of the white people who has taken one of the townhouses, and his girlfriend is very overtly racist. And Sydney and Theo have a kind of like unlikely friendship, then an unlikely romance, and Sydney's never entirely sure whether she can trust Theo or not, obviously given the situation that she's in. But I just felt like there was too freaking much of it, and it didn't need to be there. I did not need a romance in that plot. It completely derailed any of the tension for me. I felt myself constantly just thinking, when is this chapter going to be over so we can get back to what's actually happening? The investigation portion started to feel like smaller and smaller and more background, while the romance became more and more foreground, and I was just not enjoying that. And it's interesting because I actually didn't know that Alyssa Cole is a romance writer predominantly, and that this is her first thriller. I had absolutely no idea about that, again, until I went onto Goodreads to mark it as DNF. And I wonder if I had known that going in, that my expectations would have been different and I wouldn't have been quite as bothered, but I suspect I would still have been quite knocked out of the story by it. And then the conclusion of the novel pretty much went exactly along the course of a very popular recent horror film. I'm not going to say which one because I don't want to spoil it. So I was talking to my book buddy about this one, who is of course the lovely Kirsty, my podcast partner in crime, and Kirsty didn't have any problem with the fact that this novel essentially retold a really recent big horror hit, because Kirsty likened it to other retellings where like you have a retelling of Jane Austen, more on that coming later on in this video, or where you have like a retelling of Shakespeare, and although there is the same plot mechanics, it is a different story. And unfortunately that wasn't how it felt for me. I also love a retelling when it's done really well, but this one wasn't so much a retelling as a direct telling. It was exactly the same plot. There were a couple of tiny differences in the end, but it was exactly the same plot. And because I had seen that movie right at the beginning, I knew exactly where it was going, and that was pretty crap. And as a reader who really likes not to know anything, like nothing at all, that completely ruined the suspension of disbelief for me. So unfortunately this one was not for me. Let's go back to another absolute top. I picked up this book and read it pretty much like 2 days after it appeared in one sitting because it was so freaking good, and I'm so glad that I did it. And it is Thornhill by Pam Smythe. This one is a mixed media one. It's a combination of graphic novel and diary entries set in 2 different times. Our graphic novel follows us in the present day and is told entirely through pictures, and our diary entries are set in the 80s and are told just entirely in words, and it is really nice. This one is about Ella. She has just lost her mother and her dad has moved them to a new area for work. He is not around very much, and her bedroom looks onto the ruins of Thornhill, which used to be a children's home in the 80s. She is very, very lonely. She has a lot of time to herself, and she sees in the ruins of Thornhill the shadow of a girl, the same girl every time, and she decides to sneak into the ruins to investigate them and see if she can find this girl. Meanwhile, we are being told in diary entries about a girl who lives in Thornhill and who is absolutely terrified of one of the other residents there, and both of these storylines kind of work towards a point where they collide, and it's super creepy. I felt kind of like it was a boulder rolling downhill and I couldn't stop it. I could see the inevitability of where it was going, but it was like the speed and the momentum was just crashing past me and I couldn't get a grip on it. I couldn't make it stop. And because of that, I think it's a really clever haunted house novel. With quite a lot of haunted house novels, although you know that the haunting is going to happen, you don't really know where it's going. You don't know how it's going to manifest, or who's going to get out of it alive, or whether the characters are going to see ghosts. With this one, it pretty much set out its stall in the first couple of pages, and you knew that there was no stopping it, and you knew where it was going, and that was the horrifying thing. Not even necessarily the things that happened to the characters, but the horrifying thing was that you couldn't stop it. I'm really, really pleased that I picked this one up, and if you're looking for a quick horror read, or if you have read Through the Woods by Emily Carroll and you're looking for the same kind of experience, I would definitely recommend this one. Okay, in order to finish on a high note, I'm going to talk about my last 2 bottoms back to back. The first one that I have got is Charlotte by Helen Moffat. I am so sad about this one. This is of course a take on Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice that follows Charlotte Lucas. Slight spoilers for Pride and Prejudice here. If you haven't read it, maybe just skip to the end of this section. Charlotte is of course Lizzie's friend who ends up with essentially her sloppy seconds. She has married Mr. Collins, who nobody wanted for so many reasons, and she is forced with a scenario in which she has to make her life work. And I have always wanted a continuation of this story from Charlotte's point of view, and I was so excited for that. And in fact, at the beginning of this novel, I was very there for it. So we follow Charlotte Lucas many years after the events in Pride and Prejudice. She has been married to Mr. Collins for a number of years and she has a couple of kids. And at the beginning of this novel, one of her children, who has had continuous health issues for all of his life, sadly passes away. And the moment between Charlotte and Mr. Collins in this novel is something that I genuinely am not going to forget anytime soon. It was so touching, it was so perfect. But here's what happened for me. At the beginning of this novel, we are really only getting things from Charlotte's point of view, so we're getting her inner monologue, and any dialogue that we get with Mr. Collins is kind of filtered through her thoughts essentially. And then Lizzie comes to visit, of course, after her son has died. Lizzie comes to visit and we start to get actual dialogue between characters, and it was hilarious, but not in a good way. I understand that it is difficult as a modern writer to make period language sound compelling, but wowzers. I am willing to forgive an awful lot, but the dialogue between characters in this sounded like a high school kid who had just read Pride and Prejudice and was trying to do like a dramatic scene with the characters and was trying to write period language. It was a big fail for me, which is so sad because look at how beautiful this book is and now I have to unhaul it. And as I promised, there was one more bottom, and it's interesting that 2 of the bottoms on this list were not horror books this month. This is When Katie Met Cassidy by Camille Perry, and it is a short female-female romance. I am a big fan of not taking scary books to bed with me right before I'm about to fall asleep, and not just because I'm like, oh, I might be scared and then have to sleep with the light on, but also because I don't want to feel depressed or afraid or thinking about death or, you know, any of those things right before I'm trying to like turn my brain off and get some good rest before I go to sleep. So I was lying there not able to sleep but with not enough motivation to come into my library and to pick a book, and so I picked up this book on my Kindle. It had been really like rave reviewed by quite a few people that I knew, and I freaking hated it. This is about Katie, who is a really successful lawyer, really pretty, very feminine, and is also engaged to a man, and then she meets Cassidy, who is incredibly masculine and wears traditionally masculine clothes, and you can see where this is going. And that was pretty much my issue with it. I was looking forward to like an unlikely romance that just happened and took the characters by surprise, and instead what I got was all the stereotypes in so few pages. There were just so many things wrong with this. It assumes that women who identify as gay and who wear masculine clothing are going to behave like men, and so therefore it gives Cassidy the tropes of being like a womanizer and treating people like they're quite disposable. There's this moment where it's this massive revelation that she wears men's underwear and doesn't even wear any feminine clothes underneath the overtly masculine clothes. And of course she's also devastatingly handsome, and she demonstrates her power in this relationship and in the world by being rude and like crass to people, and it's weird. It was like I was reading something which was set in the 70s and it wasn't. There was just this weird vibe, like it was a queer story written for straight people, where it was like, ah, but this means this. Like when my lovely wife Helen and I are asked, but which one of you is the man in the relationship? It was full of stuff like that. I'm like, guys, it's 2020, I know there's a pandemic on, but also attitudes have moved on. Also, I hated everybody. I just hated everybody. So yeah, don't recommend. Let's finish on a high. Let's finish on a good note, because this book is the start of a series and I'm just so happy that others in this series exist. Mostly because most of the characters in this book don't exist anymore and I need to know, you know, what happens. And that book is The Enemy by Charlie Higson, which is the first book in a completed 8-book series, I think I want to say. This was a wild freaking ride. This is kind of a take on a zombie novel, let's be perfectly honest. There has been a sort of illness which took over the adults in this world, and only the kids that were like under 16 survived. And when I say survived and when I say take on a zombie novel, it's because the adults don't actually die, they're just very ill and it has affected their brain, and so when they die, they're dead. It's not like, you know, in The Walking Dead, when they die, they come back. Like, when they die, they're dead. But the adults that exist now are like creatures, they're not like people. And this first book in the series follows a group of kids that all had the same idea, and they went to a local Waitrose where they knew that there would be food and their parents shopped, and they barricaded themselves in with all of the resources that were in there. And they've been there for like a number of years now. Resources are getting slim. They're having to go further and further out to like forage for stuff essentially. And then one day a kid around about their age shows up and is like, hey, listen, there is a place where we are growing food, we're keeping animals, everything is better, but in order to get there we need to cross all of London. So that's the first that I really loved about this, is that it is set in London. I'm sick of zombie novels that are set in the States. I don't want it anymore. I want things that are recognisable to me as a Scottish person. So I was really pleased that this was set in London, because I could picture a few of the places where the stuff happened here, and that made me really happy. Like, it was interesting to think about this kind of like almost apocalyptic landscape that I knew, and so I really, really liked that. The second thing is that it gets British teens perfectly. There is a lot of diversity in these books of where the kids have come from. In fact, there are two camps of kids who have to come together. The kids who are in Waitrose, which is kind of like an upper like class supermarket, and then kids who have camped out in Morrison's, because that's where their parents shopped, and that's like where I shop. Like, Morrison's is kind of the working class out of the two supermarkets, and the kids have kind of gravitated to that different environments because that's what they knew, and they're then shoved together as these kids from all these different backgrounds and races and cultures, and they're forced to work together, and that was amazing. The other thing that I really loved about this was that it gave me the kind of page turning feel of Lockwood & Co, which, as you know, was the last horror-y young adult series that I picked up, and I absolutely freaking loved it. It gave me the same feels as that. It was just as page turning, it was just as surprising, it was just as like, ah, no! But what's also really interesting about this is that it does not hold back. There is a lot of gore and body horror on the pages here, so if that is not your thing, this is not your series. And you also need to accept pretty early on that pretty much everybody that you love is not going to be there by the end. But if you do like gore, or if you don't mind it, then pick them up, because I have already purchased the next two. Right there, you can see them right there. And I will be carrying on with them like now. So that was a very eventful tops and bottoms, was it not? There was a lot of stuff to cover there. There was a lot of ground. I think I managed to get all of my points across in a very cathartic giving them all to you way. So now I want to know, guys, have you read any of the books that were on my list? Did you like any of them? Did you hate any of them? Please let me know, because opinions live here and I love them. And based on any of the books that I loved from this tops and bottoms list, do you have any recommendations for me? Because I am always waiting for recommendations. As always, if you enjoyed this video and my saltiness, then please consider liking and subscribing for more of my face. And I will be back oh so very soon. Bye! The only compensation to unhauling books is that you don't actually have to put them back on your shelves. I can just like put them on a pile, like right here on the floor. It's like anti-tidying up, but it's so pretty.